the next installment of The Last Word, an AALAS podcast. I'm Jennifer Smith, your host. I'm also the Director of Education and Scientific Affairs at AALAS. With me today is Dr. Megan Ellis. Megan is currently a clinical veterinarian at Purdue University and recently completed her lab animal residency training at the University of Washington Department of Comparative Medicine. Before Megan attended vet school at Colorado State University, she also obtained her master's degree in infectious disease from Tufts. We are thrilled to welcome Megan today and look forward to hearing about her recent JAALAS paper titled Ammonia for Determination of Cage Change Frequency in Antelope Ground Squirrels. Hello, Megan. Thank you for joining us today. Can you tell the audience a little bit about your background?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My background is, as you mentioned, it's a little bit an infectious disease, but as you may notice, this paper isn't really delving too much into that side of things. I wanted to be a lab animal veterinarian kind of since the last year of my undergraduate, when I was so interested in research, but also interested in being a veterinarian, found this wonderful way to make those two things conjoin. And while I was undergoing my residency, we had this wonderful opportunity to work with these really unique species. And this had originally, I guess I might be getting a little into further questions, but this had originally just been something we were doing out of interest for providing best care. And I think that's really fascinating. That's a really important part of our career, is providing good care for these animals. But the fascinating thing about that is it can turn into science that we can share with everyone. So I think that's a really nice thing about this paper, and I'm really excited to talk to you about it.
Oh, that's awesome. I love this part of the podcast when I get to meet new people, and Megan and I haven't been able to meet before, so I am thrilled to always meet new people, and especially up-and-comers. You guys make us all smarter, so thank you again for your enthusiasm. And I love just hearing how people get into this field. We all have kind of sometimes a circuitous route to get here, and some folks know right away what they want to do, so I love hearing that background and just hearing how you got into it. So you've alluded to it. Let's talk about the paper a little bit. First, let's talk about your team. Could you kind of introduce our listeners to the team and maybe talk a little bit more about why you designed and completed this study?
Yeah, my team is so incredible, and I was very lucky to have them. Again, this paper kind of came up fortuitously because we had this unique opportunity with this species we hadn't had before. And Dr. Jordan Brune, was one of my senior veterinarians while I was undergoing my clinical rotations. And she really helped encourage me. She's a clinical vet over at University of Washington, where I did my residency. Dr. Brab is also a clinical veterinarian over there. Actually, I think she did just retire. So sorry, giving a little bit of outdated information, but Dr. Brad was the chair of the department and one of the clinical vets while I was over there, and she had guided me in this study as well. Dr. Patel did a wonderful job in really helping us tighten down. A very important part of getting this paper through the review process was validating the system that we had used to study ammonia, and Dr. Patel was so instrumental in doing that. She really went above and beyond to help us complete that, even as I had already moved on to my position at Purdue University. So she really helped us out with that. A wonderful team who really everyone involved did a great job with this paper and in helping me get it published. We designed and completed this study because we had this new species. We had these Antelope Ground Squirrels. We'd never worked with them before at University of Washington, and we wanted to do best care for them. I get a little into the introduction of this in the paper, in the introduction, but essentially these guys are wild caught. So, when you change cages for any species, even our domesticated small rodents, it is a stressful time in their life. They get new scent cues, their environment may look a little different. So we wanted to be careful about doing an evidence-based cage change interval, first of all, from a practical husbandry side of things, and also from the animal's well-being. But as you know, you can't just let cages go weeks and weeks without, making sure there's some level of cleanliness and standards there. So we wanted to make sure we were balancing the need for these cage changes with the species-specific needs, as well as decreasing stress and making sure they were living in a comfortable environment for them. hopefully a good description of why I designed that study.
Yeah, that is great. And thank you for all that background. Most of our listeners, I think, really enjoy hearing about the team. And I really appreciate that you were able to kind of tell what each person on the team did. And shout out to Thea, who is retired. That's awesome. You have a great team there for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we're going to jump into the meat of this paper, which is fascinating. I want to remind everybody that this is the May-June issue of JAALAS that has shipped. I received mine at the AALAS office a bit ago, so I know folks have it in their hands, and kudos to you for getting the cover. There's a really cute Antelope Ground Squirrel on the cover, so that'll remind everyone to read this paper. So for those of us, myself included, who have never worked with Antelope Ground Squirrels, and we're going to call those AGS for our conversation, could you just talk about why they're used in contemporary research and why they're so important?
One of the most fascinating things about the Antelope Ground Squirrel, and one of the main draws for their use in research, is the fact that they're a diurnal small rodent. So as many of our listeners know, it can be difficult working around the sleep-wake cycle of many of our small rodents. And so having something that does have a day cycle that's more similar to how humans experience a circadian rhythm is a big draw for using these species. And that's what, Dr. Brav and I and Dr. Brun, that we weren't studying these species primarily. It was a different research group at our university was using them for studying sleep-wake cycles, studying circadian rhythms, studying influence of that on wheel running. So a big draw to these species is going to be that diurnal circadian rhythm that is a little different from many of our small rodents.
Yeah, that was great. That was really interesting to read, and I think you hinted about this already, but your introduction does an outstanding job of really reviewing sort of the current housing practices for species that might be similar to the Antelope Ground Squirrel or the AGS. So it would be great. Could you kind of talk about that context for our listeners, and just kind of also maybe talk about how the lack of guidance relating to a species could make it difficult to sort of figure out how to house them and sort of what husbandry practices to use?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is so nice with a lot of the species we work with. We have this vast breadth of information, of prior knowledge that we can build off of, but for more unique species, that isn't always there. And I love seeing different papers, especially JAALAS does a great job of this, of all of the refined husbandry needs for different small animal species that may be unique to the research world. The people who write those papers probably can empathize with me a little on, you kind of have to make some things up as you go. You have to use the resources you have. We didn't really have a ton of guidance on, maybe we try and extrapolate from something. So for example, I talked a lot in my introduction to this paper about gerbils. We were thinking, these are both desert species. They probably have pretty similar ammonia output and pretty similar drinking habits. Spoiler alert, they don't, unfortunately.
Right.
So a lot of husbandry and housing practices are building on species that we think may be similar, but then refining that based on the evidence that we get and based on data that we collect. And that all is super important, but it can be a tough sell, and it can be a little bit tough when you're first working with these guys, figuring out what they need and how to provide it.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. And that is really why we wanted to pull this paper to talk about today as well. I think there's a lot of good takeaways for folks that maybe are using this species or maybe using another sort of unique species. So I think you have a good playbook here of how to kind of approach that. So let's jump into it. Two main hypotheses from your study is or are?
Yeah, well, first we hypothesized that our ammonia concentrations and again, all our AGS for this study were singly housed. I don't think I mentioned that earlier, but that is, as anyone who's kind of looked a lot into ammonia concentrations would know, the housing density can affect that pretty strongly. All of our AGS were singly housed. So we hypothesized that these singly housed AGS would have intracage ammonia concentrations of less than 50 parts per million for a 2-week interval. And we thought that would be independent of the bedding volume that we use, whether we used half a quart up to 2 quarts of bedding, corncob bedding only. And then we also hypothesized that females would take longer than males to reach this concentration. And unfortunately, I won't get too much into that one, but we maybe could have grabbed more females if we wanted to prove that hypothesis. Study power is important, folks.
Newsflash. Yeah. We'll get into that, but I appreciate that for sure. So thanks for sharing that, what the hypotheses were. I always try to ask that first off, just so our listeners can kind of orient themselves in case the paper's not right in front of them. So most of our listeners love to hear more about study design, of course. This is a podcast about papers. So one thing that I think is interesting about your paper is that you had to acclimatize animals after they were wild caught. So we would love if you could talk maybe a little bit about the methods of acclimation and or any best practices that sort of you came up with for that.
Yeah, acclimation for these animals was a lot of trying to provide them with fairly similar environments to what they may experience, even just in, the amount of room noise, the temperature, the humidity, making sure those parameters might be within good standards, but also, making sure they're not experiencing too much cold, any heat stress, anything like that. Really making sure that we're not putting too much stress on the animals in the acclimation period, making sure if we do have to change cages, do animal checks, that we are doing them with care and attention paid to the amount of stress that we're putting on these animals, right? It's not like a mouse cage where, even when we're doing our most refined handling, we can do that without introducing too much stress. With these wild caught guys, it's a little more of a consideration for them.
Sure.
The research group did a wonderful job catching them, and they came over to our university after they also had a bit of a car ride from their wild caught in Oregon, and then they come up to Seattle. So yeah, we also had to acclimate them to after their little transport time, but all of them did quite well and settled in really nicely.
That's great. And I think it's great that you were able to get both males and females. That's, I guess there's some complexity there, I'm sure. Any thoughts on that?
Well, interestingly, the goal of getting males and females ended up not featuring too much in the paper or in anything I did personally. The plan had been this investigator had a little bit of interest in building a colony of these animals, but unfortunately, and this speaks to a lot of the research that's done on how to best maintain breeding animals. That never ended up being the goal of the paper, anything we studied, and it would have required quite a few more studies on, best housing practices for that. But they did aim to capture both male and female animals. They were checking them in the traps, and if they ended up catching quite a few males, and that's something that I, couldn't get into in the paper, but I've always been curious about, like, what really drives, is that just luck of the draw? Is there some personality differences? I'm curious about that. But I guess it'll remain a mystery for now until someone else does it. Exactly. Yeah. Giving folks ideas out here.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for talking about that. We do really like to talk about having both sexes represented in research, and so I always try to ask, how that comes about. So thanks for addressing that. So I think most important in this study was the cage design, right? So what do? You got this new species. How do you modify the cages? I loved reading about how you did that with your team, and I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit more for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. The modification of the cages was a little bit within our control, but we had this big, important thing to consider in our modification of the cages, and that is study design. So the researchers were like, yeah, it's super cool that you want to study all this, but we need these squirrels to run on wheels at some point. So please don't just throw a ton of bedding in there. You have to be careful about what you're doing that may influence the desired goals of the researchers. They have that wonderful wheel that they actually man, they seem to really enjoy running on those. Spent a good amount of time doing that. And we had to make sure in our manipulation of the cages that stayed available to them. So we were still using just polycarbonate cages, nothing too exciting, the 500 mil ones. I thought about, I bet, we could create the little tunnels between them and rig them up. And maybe in a future design, that would have been something really interesting to go into, to see, you have this activity chamber and also this housing living chamber. But we ended up just doing the single cage, making sure that wheel was available and easy for them to reach. We tried a few different enrichment items for them, and they did really seem to enjoy tunnels and things like that. But at the end of the day, the investigators' study design needed to kind of be at the forefront here, and we needed to make sure that they were still getting that wheel access and that wheel time. So
Sure.
We manipulated the bedding a little, trying to give them some of that natural burrowing ability. And honestly, even different beddings could have been kind of interesting in this. Things that are a little easier for them to burrow into could have been something to be looked into. But what we ended up on was just regular old corncob bedding, because not only had there been a lot of studies on ground squirrels that have been done on this corncob bedding before. So in a behavioral study, behaviorists don't want to manipulate things too much, but also because it is a pretty good bedding for ammonia control, for cleanliness of cages, for things like that.
Great. Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions, was just sort of how you landed on the corncob bedding. And it sounds like you kind of used previous, experience or with similar but different species. So I think that's great.
And now it's time for a short break.
Ready to boost your team's skills in lab animal science? Discover the AALAS Learning Library. Train all your staff in one place, from investigators to managers, and earn AALAS, CEUs, and RACE CEs with discounts for groups. Sign up for free to access select courses instantly and explore valuable resources to enhance your team's expertise. Elevate your learning with AALAS Learning Library. AALAS is now on all your favorite social platforms. If you want to be in the know around upcoming deadlines, highlights from this month's journals, or even just fun holidays, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram today.
Okay, so we've kind of talked more about your methodology. It would be great now to sort of talk about your results and kind of what you found out. So I don't know, do you want to give us sort of a good overview of your results? Any interpretation?
Absolutely. So on our results, something that we found, and this totally was unexpected. We're thinking there are these desert adapted species, these antelope ground squirrels. They're not going to produce too much ammonia. They're not going to stink up their cages too bad. What we found is they actually do have a pretty good rate of ammonia accumulation, especially at those lower bedding volumes. And we ended up having to come in and change cages every 4 or 5 days. We were doing this as essentially I was coming in every morning and measuring the ammonia. And then the wonderful grad student for the lab that we were working with was changing cages as we needed to per our set parameters. So I, acknowledged him in the acknowledgements. He did a lot of work. I would text him like, all right, we need this one changed. He was on top of things. It was incredible. But what we found was that our lower bedding volumes at the half quart and at the 3/4 quart weren't controlling ammonia enough that we found that the levels were appropriate for animals to be in for a week. And that was really surprising to us, even in static cages. And again, our baseline was durables, and that just goes to show you can't say just because this species and this species have some similar environments, doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be the same for both of them. So
Right. Excellent point there, for sure.
Yeah. So we ended up finding that, nope, we weren't going to be able to use that much bedding successfully. We did find that on a quart bedding that all of them stayed under our set parameters of ammonia. Everything looked great for a week. It was even better on 2 quarts of bedding. Unfortunately, that ended up being a little too much bedding for the wheels to all run appropriately.
Yeah.
Some of them just love to put it under their wheels. And so we ended up going with a quart for the final volume, and luckily that worked well for a week cage change frequency. We were not able to. Our goal had been, maybe we can give this data to the IACUC and say, we could extend our cage change interval to 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks for these desert adapted species that shouldn't
right.
be producing that much ammonia. No. We did not get any changes to that. It was a weak cage change. We also found something that was intuitive but nice to see in the data is this very strong negative correlation between like the water loss from the water bottles and the time to cage change, like time under 50 parts per million. So the more these ground AGS were losing from their water bottles, and brief aside, we always considered it water bottle loss, not amount that they drank, because we were not doing any study that was directly characterizing drinking habits. We were not doing metabolic cages or things like that.
Got it. Right.
We could not say for 100% certainty all 25 mils went into the ground squirrel.
Right.
But it did come out of the water bottle.
Yes.
And whether that's going into the ground squirrel and coming up through urine or making the bedding more damp, which can also increase intercage humidity and then change the ammonia volatilization. Regardless, we found that really strong correlation. The more water loss from the bottles, the sooner we would have to change those cages.
Yeah, that's great.
And I mentioned a hypothesis about males and females, and that didn't end up in our results simply because we didn't have the power to definitively say anything about the difference between males and females. There's a ton of variation between individuals and how fast they either accumulated ammonia or didn't in their cages. And therefore, with a pretty small sample size over in the females, we didn't end up having that power to say anything definitively between male and female.
Yeah, I found that to be one of the most interesting parts of this paper for sure. So I'm glad we talked about that a little bit. Wow. So you approached this study to serve as evidence-based validation for how you're going to house and do husbandry for these ground squirrels. What was your final validation, or was that achieved, I should say?
Yeah, what we ended up validating is that our IACUC's recommendation of these animals are on static caging. They should be changed every week. We validated that was very appropriate, that trying to push it out to 2 weeks, may have brought the ammonia concentrations up higher. We did not do the histopathology or aversion test that would have said that, higher than 50 parts per million would be detrimental or dangerous to these animals, but we didn't want to kind of push it without that evidence that it wouldn't be detrimental, right?
Sure.
So going by the set standards for this, and we ended up validating, this week cage change interval is appropriate. And unfortunately, we weren't able to avoid a little bit of stress by pushing that out. But I do hope that we did, and I do think that we found an evidence-based answer to this.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so your study talked about water consumption, and I thought that was really interesting. We discussed this a little bit earlier, but I was wondering if you could discuss further kind of this predicted water consumption and how that related to the greater than 50 ppm ammonia concentration. And as a follow-up, if you could kind of reiterate to us how you got to that greater than 50 ppm ammonia concentration for your study.
Yeah, so as far as the correlation between water consumption and the ammonia concentration within cages, I thought that was a really interesting part to study, because I thought, first of all, I think I was a little curious even just how much water that these guys would be consuming out in the wild. They have these field studies that show they're consuming actually quite a bit lower than what we found them consuming in a captive environment. And
that interesting. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. I know some species, they teach you this when you're studying for boards. It comes up on practice exams, but
Sure.
some species will drink themselves into diabetes insipidus. So ground squirrels aren't quite that bad, but they definitely consume a little more than they might in the wild.
Okay.
And we were looking at that partly to see, how that may differ, and partly to see how it may affect the ammonia, intracage ammonia, because what we thought is it could be indicative of how much they drink, maybe at least going into, or at least a little bit predictive of how much they're urinating, but also regardless how much they drink or how much they use from their water bottle, overall, whether they're drinking it and urinating it out or whether they're playing with it, it's going to factor into the intracage humidity. It's going to change the intracage environment. And the intercage environment has been very correlated to ammonia buildup in cages for mouse cages. A few studies have looked into how humidity affects the ammonia in mouse cages. So I thought that would be interesting to look into. And as for 50 parts per million, it's always an interesting thing, because I find that our standards for determining acceptable ammonia levels for species really does vary. And even in our small rodent species, it's never quite a cut and dry answer. So, for example, in our mouse studies, you've seen that pathology can be seen after 50 parts per million, but mice don't really show aversion to ammonia until it's up to 110 parts per million. And that's why we settled on 50, is kind of just that very low line where we start seeing pathology in murine species, thinking that this pathology in the respiratory epithelium, the nasal epithelium, it'll be quite similar to the way it is in mice. So I wouldn't want to risk them being at a higher level than what we start seeing pathology at in mice. I think I kind of talked around that 12 different ways. So Let me know if it wasn't clear.
Yeah. So thanks, Megan. That's good. I really appreciate hearing about that. And I always try to ask our guests questions about things like that, about using something like 50 parts per million ammonia, just because it's something that's pretty standardly used. And it's always good to know sort of how that factored into your studies. So thanks. And thanks again for talking about the water consumption and how that did factor into your final validation. I think that's important, especially for our listeners who might be trying to do a similar type of study with a new species. So I guess final conclusions on bedding then. Let's talk about that a little bit. What did you find with the bedding volume, and then how did it affect the ammonia concentration or accumulation?
So what we found with the bedding volume is that there was a statistically significant effect of bedding volume on the number of days it took the cages to reach over 50 parts per million, or our ammonia thresholds for these guys. So the higher bedding volumes did get those cage changes out a little longer. We found there was a significant difference between both 2-quart and half-quart and 3-quarter quart. We didn't find any significant differences between a half-quart and 3-quarter quarts as far as the amount of time it took them to reach this greater than 50 parts per million. And that I remember when I was writing this paper, I saw a fairly recent study at that time that showed that providing 150%, I think it was, of the normal amount of bedding in IVC didn't statistically affect ammonia accumulation, but even greater volumes might. And our 2-quart volume was 400 times as much as our half-quart, right? So we're really ramping that up, and it is, we did see an effect on the ammonia accumulation for that very high level of bedding.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. And of course, you got to balance that spinning wheel spinning. So,
yes.
Yeah, you had a lot of factors here. So that's great, though. I appreciate hearing all about that. You alluded to your statistical findings, so it would be great if you could kind of share with us. Lots of people that listen to our podcast love statistics, so especially relating to sex in this study. Could you summarize that?
Yeah, again, I could not prove anything statistically as far as the sex of the animals goes and how that may have affected ammonia buildup. It would have been a really fascinating thing to be able to show some changes in that or some effect of that, but we simply didn't have the power to do that. We ended up as I developed the study, I was, thinking very early on, I was like, okay, well, if there is not a lot of variation in the individual animals, even though we have a small number of females, I think it should be fine. However, if you look at our graphs at the first figures, you can see this incredible variation between individuals. And so that combination of the intra-individual variation and the small number of female animals, we didn't end up having the power to do any statistics. And I think it's also important in your statistical analysis to, if this was a study where we were solely catching ground squirrels for the purpose of, validating this, solely catching them for the purpose of looking at difference in ammonia accumulation between sexes, that is something you would want to have down pat before you chose how many squirrels of each sex you'd catch.
Yeah.
And that's always so important to remember. I think well-powered studies, I think it's a really important part of this field. It's a really important part of research in general. And it's something that sometimes can get forgotten. I think our statistics sometimes just in general can fall by the wayside, but knowing the power is one of the cornerstones of appropriate number of animal use. So it's something that I hold dear in my heart, even if it didn't shine through in this study, unfortunately.
Yeah, I love that you called that out, and I really appreciate your honesty, as well as just giving that nugget of advice, that the statistics and the power, those things are important, and certainly in the review of journal articles, that's very important, but just in general. And so I really appreciate that feedback. So we're getting to the end. I know we could talk all day, but we're getting to the end. I have a final question. I ask this of everyone. But before I do, I think we're ready to kind of dub you the Antelope Ground Squirrel Queen. I mean, you are an expert in my eyes, so thank you. So this question's a little weird, but now that you've sort of worked with the wild-caught species, you've done a great job getting some evidence-based validation on housing for your institution, which is fantastic. I'm sure your IACUC loves you. I guess the question would be, what advice would you give anybody listening that needs to do something similar, maybe not in an antelope ground squirrel, but maybe in something else? What advice would you give them?
Well, this is kind of a tough one because this is something that occurred to me or, became more prevalent in the forefront of my mind after I even left the University of Washington. And this is partially because I'm over here at Purdue University and I have a wonderful tech. And she used to work in zoo medicine. And the wealth of information she has about uncommon species is just incredible. And, we work with these species and occasionally we run across one that's not super common. That might not be something, you would necessarily see in a zoo. But using resources that aren't only people in your field and utilizing resources of these scientists who have worked with these species at different institutions for 20 or 30 years, or people who work with these species in the field and know intimately what their housing situation looks like, how they behave. Are they burrowing animals that have this latrine area and everything else is clean? They don't really get much ammonia here, so they don't really like it, or do they just go wherever and it may not affect them as much? Speaking to folks with a background in zoo medicine or in things like that who have this knowledge of how to make the best of limited spaces and really create an environment that's ideal for an animal. I guess my advice is that we don't have a lot of guidance as far as these species go. And that can be scary, but it can also be a place where there is that room for creativity and for learning from others and for eliciting feedback and knowledge from others who may have different perspectives on this. And I think that wasn't something I really saw as clearly when I was doing this study. And now that I've had a different perspective, I'm like, it's so fascinating. This is a field where we can learn so much from a lot of different people from all kinds of backgrounds. And I think that would be ideal for any unique, non-typical species, is taking advantage of those people from different backgrounds and their knowledge.
Wow. That is really profound. I appreciate that so much. And this is why I appreciate talking to the up-and-comers on our podcast. You guys add so much to the breadth of what we're doing in Lab Animal. And I just so appreciate you and so appreciate your feedback on, just taking a step back and talking to people who might know more than you. I think we all forget that. So thanks again for that. All right. Yeah.
I was going to say, the more I'm learning, I'm just like, wow, there's so much I don't know. That's the incredible thing about this field. There's someone who does know it.
Yes. Welcome to Lab Animal. No, I love it. All right. Well, Megan, we are at the end. I'm sorry. This was really great. So we really appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast today. I know our audience learned a lot. I know I did too. So for everyone listening, we invite you to subscribe, leave us your comments, questions in the section below. We invite you to consider submitting your current or future research to the AALAS scientific journals. That's JAALAS and CompMed. You can always find us on our socials, or you can always email me, info@aalas.org. We really want to hear your feedback. We want to know what you think of this episode, all the others. And finally, thanks for listening to the Last Word in AALAS podcast. Be on the lookout for information on future episodes dropping monthly. Thanks so much.